I'd really like to thank JD and the DASER program for inviting me to talk about my work. Ideas from science have always been conceptual and metaphorical inspirations. So this is a very exciting forum for me. I'd also like to thank Darcy Gentleman for working with me on this, since I've never used a written text for a talk before. In order to stay on track, because I am sort of loopy, I've written this one out. In thinking about the theme conceptual collisions, I imagined a kind of generative dialectic that occurs when ideas cross-pollinate and collision. I've always sought these constructive dialectics, these fruitful oppositions, in the conceptual framework for my paintings. For this talk, I will focus on a selection of 8 paintings produced over a span of 30 years to give you some insight into how these constructive collisions have provided generative fuel for my work. The changes from painting to painting might be a little abrupt since I'm skipping so many intermediate steps, but you can visit my website if you want to fill in the gaps. I've been making abstract paintings for over 40 years. Early on, I was intrigued by modern art and particularly abstraction. I was especially drawn to the idea that there's a language of form beyond iconography, a visual vocabulary that provides a foundation for how we perceive art and indeed all images. I was initially fascinated by Cubism and Futurism and Constructivism. The works of these artists seem to address energy and space, not just the things themselves. Later, the works of Mondrian and Pollock became my polar ancestors. I was drawn to Mondrian's formal compositional balance and dynamic equilibrium, and I was equally drawn to the non-hierarchical fields of energy found in Pollock's work. I wanted to somehow conflate the two to create something simultaneously rational and expressive. This crossroads or collision, if you will, between the rational and analytic on one hand and the intuitive and poetic on the other has been central to my work ever since. So how did I get to this love of constructive collisions? How did I get to a process of juggling multiple dialectical oppositions as a generative thought process for painting? Like that of many other artists, my work is really a series of objects into which I compress my digested life and consciousness. Everything from my most extended research and study, novels I read, music I listen to, even the way a piece of spaghetti happens to land on the floor during dinner might find its way into my paintings. One particular stream of thought that's gone into my work has been inspired by my interest in science, and especially physics and geometry. Niels Bohr's principle of complementarity was one such idea from physics. Simplified, it states that neither particle nor wave provide a complete description of the fundamental properties of subatomic matter. Both properties, wave and particle, must be included for a complete description. It is not either or, but both and. I learned early on, however, to take great care in talking about how my decidedly limited knowledge of various scientific fields has informed my work. Curators and critics will often pounce on these elements of study and influence as literal sources of the abstract images in the paintings. The truth is, these influences stand among many. My paintings don't illustrate scientific principles or mathematical concepts. They play with them. They sing along. My intention is more generalized and poetic and really hinges on how these ideas become metaphorical and evocative through a painting process that carries each work towards an unpredictable complexity, one that is discovered rather than imposed or designed. The painting projected up here is Trapdoor from 1986. It is 83 inches tall, 71 inches wide. I chose it as a starting image because it's a good point at which to step into the continuous path of painting that my work has taken over 40 years. Trapdoor exploits the ambiguous reversible qualities of its linear schematic drawing. It wants to create the illusion of space, but every time it opens up, it slams flat back to the surface. No single element or configuration dominates, which forces the eye to switch and shift in a slipping rotation of attention. The optically intense color, which I never really planned but emerges in the process, amplifies this effect. At first glance, it looks precise and ruled, but like all my paintings, upon closer inspection, it is stubbornly hand-painted and somewhat crude. I don't use tape for hard edges, and I generally use paint right out of the tube without thinning it. In the end, I ask the viewer to accept that there is no singular resolution of all these countervailing elements. and to engage in this shifting series of readings that refuses to settle. This painting, from a few years later, is titled Fourth Flight. It's 78 by 84 inches, and like Trapdoor, began with a small schematic drawing. When I say small, I mean like small. It poses the stability of symmetry against rotation, spinning, and expansion. Like those in Trapdoor, some of the forms have spatial or illusionistic information, but it doesn't hold. The spatial cues are contradictory, and the painting buzzes tensely, oscillating between holding tight to a symmetrical emblematic configuration and spinning out and off the canvas. Again, I ask the viewer to accept a somewhat symphonic and contrapuntal collection of oppositions. Any hierarchy that emerges is fleeting and really dependent on the viewer's attention. We now jump forward about 8 years. This painting is titled Timelock. It's 77 inches square from 1997. As I moved towards this painting, I had begun to use thicker paint, letting the physical surface replace many of the articulated details of the early work. I had slowly abandoned the linear, almost wireframe feel of earlier paintings and began to use a grid and geometric tiling structures to develop flat, interlocking shapes. The reversible ambiguity of linear forms in earlier paintings is replaced with figure-ground confusion. Think of the faces in the vase illusion, where a perceptual process called contour rivalry makes it impossible to see both the faces and the vase simultaneously. We see one or the other, with our perception fading and reversing after 15 to 30 seconds. I exploit aspects of this illusion as I weave the various elements in the painting together. The painting process itself that I employed for Timelock embodies contradiction and collision. Using an underlying grid, I would draw the linear structure on the canvas, including an array of free-drawn spirals. I would then lay the painting on the floor and retrace all the spirals with liquid paint, developing color intuitively in layers. I would then put the painting back up on the wall and repaint all the liquid looping lines that were painted spontaneously with opaque oil paint. I then dragged horizontal brush strokes of thick white paint across some of the forms, the lighter areas in here, creating the basic figure ground configuration. I would paint and repaint elements, adjusting color, while I glazed transparent color over the thicker white paint. Earlier layers are never completely hidden, with echoes rising through to the surface in a variety of ways. I also began to use the grid more explicitly, sliding the interlocking pattern forms off of symmetry. This destabilized the predictability of the pattern and the figure-ground relationships. These were much flatter paintings. Gone were the dynamic diagonals and space-making forms of the earlier work, but the spatial tension was there, pushing and pulling, trying to escape the flatness. In 5 to 6 to 5, from 2004, you can see that I'm still mixing up figure and ground, but I've abandoned the thick brick-like brushstrokes through which you could see the earlier layers. I'd become more interested in transparency and layered color. Drips and splatters from the first stages of the painting became, in varying degrees, emphasized by repainting and being sort of pulled up through the layers of the painting. This is one of the best examples of this kind of figure-ground confusion that I was seeking, really, because you can't hold one reading of it for very long. It slips continually from your grasp, shifting to another read, revealing what the curator David Moose once called, quote, a fictive ground of thought, of vision striving to make sense of its own perception, unquote. I then began a series of paintings where I returned to emphasizing the overlaid linear structures, but at a different scale than the earlier work. I played with the intersections and overlaps of the competing forms. I also created the ground from many layers of semi-transparent white paint, over which I would glaze transparent color to push the whites around. Backbeat, 77 inches square from 2005 is a good example from this series. A set of 4 spirals interacts with a linear geometric structure. The intersections of the stacked elements are painted black and kind of stitch everything together, forcing connection and interaction. Again, The viewer is asked to accept a shifting sense of unity and resolution. The number of terms is fewer, but the relationships are more finely tuned. And again, it's not either or, but both and. Moving forward, my work underwent another shift. I started playing more explicitly with the grid. In paintings like Liquid Cube, 77 inches square, from 2010, I would draw a ruled grid and then overlay a range of free-drawn gestural lines, spirals, arcs, or waveforms. I would place circles at the intersections of the original grid and the gestural lines and bury the connectors with layers of paint. If the circles overlapped, I would allow them to combine. The painting became even flatter and the color simpler. I wanted to reduce the terms and explore the edge between order and disorder. These paintings feel like slices through some larger spatial volume or process, almost like a CAT scan slices through your body. There's still some subtle figure ground tension in there, but it's a lesser element, more localized and fugitive. I think what I like most about these paintings is that you can feel the underlying order and structure, but you can't quite put your finger on it. Finally, I want to show slides of a couple of more recent paintings that continue to explore the collision between rule-based procedures and painterly processes. The first, from 2014, is Pendulum Inside. It is 60 by 60 inches and was created by drawing arcing lines over a grid and placing a rectangle perpendicular to either the vertical or horizontal grid line with which the arcs intersect. If the rectangles overlapped, I allowed them to combine into larger and surprisingly unpredictable configurations. I also painted soft gray circles at any grid intersections that did not touch or interfere with the rectilinear forms. Holding to the original orthogonal grid, these discs pose another opposition to the red form's desire to create space. As I have moved into these simpler and flatter paintings, the optical pyrotechnics of earlier works has settled into a subtler but sneakily subversive space. The last painting I'll show is one that I finished a little over a year ago. It's titled Rolling Switches, and it's 60 by 60 inches. In this one, I used a simple rule of alternating rectangles on either side of a series of free-drawn overlapping loops. I'm repeatedly surprised by the formations that occur when the rectangles intersect and combine. They flow along the lines, but the simple act of switching them from side to side produces some magic. The looping forms connect, wanting to create some sort of spatial information, but the flattened connections with no overlap or transparency deny the spatial push. The eye cannot really follow a single path. Sidetracks and substructures emerge fluidly. In this one, and others from this series, I alternately paint and repaint both the positive forms and the white ground, negotiating the edges and piecing them together rather than painting one on top of another. This embeds the forms in the field and activates that primary tension between the optical and the tactile that is present in all my work. So that brings us to the end of my talk. I hope that I've given you a window into some of the ideas that provide a foundation for my work, and indeed how ideas from outside of art can be formative and generative. Wherever my work goes in the future, I am certain that constructive collisions will be part of the picture. Thank you.